In 1953, South Korea's average income per person was $67 a year. Not per month, per year. That number placed it below Haiti, below Sudan, and below almost every country in sub-Saharan Africa. Its capital, Seoul, had been captured and recaptured 4 times during the Korean War and was largely rubble. Its agricultural land was devastated. Half of its industrial capacity, which had never been large to begin with, had been destroyed. It had no oil, no significant mineral wealth, no established financial system, no functioning capital markets, and a population that was more than 80% rural, with literacy rates well below the global average. The United States Agency for International Development, the institution whose entire purpose was finding countries that could develop, looked at South Korea in 1953 and internally assessed it as a country with no realistic prospect of self-sustaining economic growth. The word they used in classified assessments was hopeless. 40 years later, South Korea had the 13th largest economy on Earth. Samsung was competing with Sony and winning. Hyundai was selling cars in America. POSCO had become one of the most efficient steel producers in the world. The average South Korean income had grown by more than 1,000% in real terms, the fastest sustained increase in living standards ever recorded for a country of that size over that time period. This is the video that explains exactly how that happened. Not the legend, not the miracle narrative. The exact mechanism, the specific decisions, and the specific sequence made by specific people that turned the most unpromising starting point in modern economic history into one of the most successful development stories ever documented. Most explanations of South Korea's rise point to education, or to American aid, or to the work ethic of Korean people. These explanations are not wrong, but they are incomplete in a way that matters, because dozens of countries had similar levels of education investment, received similar levels of foreign aid, and had populations working just as hard, and did not produce anything like South Korea's outcome. The difference was not the inputs. The difference was the mechanism that directed those inputs. And that mechanism was not accidental. It was designed. The starting point of the mechanism was a man named Park Chung-hee, who took power in a military coup in 1961. Park is a complicated historical figure, authoritarian, ruthless toward political opposition, responsible for serious human rights abuses. But what matters for this analysis is not his politics. What matters is the economic model he implemented, because it was unlike anything any developing country had tried before in a systematic way, and it worked at a scale that transformed the field of development economics. Park's core insight was simple and radical. A poor country cannot develop by letting markets allocate capital freely, because markets in a poor country have no capital to allocate. Private investors in 1961 South Korea were not going to build a steel industry from scratch, or an automotive industry, or a semiconductor industry, because the risks were too high, the time horizons too long, and the capital requirements too large for any private actor to absorb. If South Korea was going to industrialize, the government had to direct the process, not as a communist state directing all production, but as a strategic actor deciding which industries to build, in which sequence, and then concentrating the country's limited resources into making those industries globally competitive. This was the first decision of the mechanism. The government would pick the industries, not the market, and this decision would prove to be the foundation of everything that followed. But picking industries is not enough. Every government that has tried industrial policy has picked industries. Most of them failed. What South Korea did differently, the part of the mechanism that almost no analysis explains clearly, was what happened after the industries were picked. Because picking is easy, building a company that can compete globally from nothing in a country with no capital and no technology is not. The second decision of the mechanism was the chaebol system. Park's government identified a small number of Korean family-owned conglomerates, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, Daewoo, Lotte, and made them the vehicles for industrialization. The government gave these companies something that no private investor in Korea could provide: access to cheap, directed credit from state-controlled banks, protected domestic markets that prevented foreign competition from destroying them before they could scale, and explicit export targets that had to be met as a condition for continued government support. This last element is the part of the mechanism that made South Korea different from every other country that attempted industrial policy. The chaebols were not simply given subsidies and protection, they were given subsidies and protection in exchange for performance, specifically export performance measured in hard currency. If a chaebol met its export targets, it received more credit, more protection, more government contracts. If it failed to meet them, support was cut. The mechanism created competition not between Korean companies and foreign companies in the domestic market. That competition would have destroyed Korean companies immediately, but between Korean companies for government favor, measured by their ability to compete internationally. The government was not picking winners. It was creating a tournament in which survival depended on becoming globally competitive and providing the resources necessary to make that competition possible. But here is the specific sequence that made this work when the same approach failed in other countries, because the sequence mattered as much as the strategy. Park did not try to build everything at once. He built industries in a deliberate order, and the order was determined by a single logic. Each industry had to produce inputs that the next industry needed. The sequence began with textiles and light manufacturing in the early 1960s, industries that required low capital, low technology, and large amounts of labor, of which South Korea had an abundance. These industries generated the first export revenues and the first pool of industrial workers who understood factory discipline and production processes. In the late 1960s, the government moved to heavy and chemical industries, steel, petrochemicals, shipbuilding. POSCO, the state-owned steel company founded in 1968 with technology licensed from Japan, was producing steel within 3 years at quality levels that surprised every international analyst who had predicted failure. The steel fed the shipbuilding industry. The shipbuilding industry fed the automotive industry. Each sector produced the workforce, the supply chains, and the foreign currency revenues that made the next sector possible. By the 1980s, South Korea was moving into electronics and semiconductors, high technology industries that required the industrial workforce, the engineering culture, and the capital base that 20 years of sequenced development had produced. Samsung's entry into semiconductors in 1983 was not a gamble by a consumer electronics company trying something new. It was the culmination of a 20-year sequence in which every prior stage had built exactly the capabilities that the semiconductor industry required. The mechanism was not a miracle, it was a staircase, and each step was deliberately placed to make the next step reachable. And yet the same mechanism, applied by other governments in other countries, produced very different results. The question that development economists spent decades arguing about is why South Korea succeeded where so many others failed at the same strategy. The answer is in one element of the mechanism that is almost always missing when other governments try to replicate it. The missing element is discipline, specifically the willingness to withdraw support from failures. The chaebol system only worked because the government was genuinely willing to cut off companies that did not perform. In the early years of the program, several companies that received government backing failed to meet export targets and lost their support. This was not a minor detail. It was the mechanism's enforcement system. The entire logic of the chaebol model depended on the performance condition being real, on companies understanding that protection and credit were conditional, not guaranteed. When other governments attempted industrial policy without this enforcement discipline, when they picked industries and subsidized companies but could not bring themselves to withdraw support from failures for political reasons, they produced not chaebols, but cronies. Companies that were permanently protected, permanently subsidized, permanently insulated from the pressure to become globally competitive. The difference between a chaebol and a crony is not the subsidy. It is the condition attached to the subsidy and the government's credibility in enforcing that condition. South Korea's government had that credibility, at least in the early decades. Most governments that tried the same model did not. That credibility gap is the entire explanation for why the mechanism produced a Samsung in Seoul and produced nothing comparable in countries that attempted the same strategy. The South Korean mechanism has one final chapter that the legend always omits, and it matters for understanding the limits of what was built. By the late 1990s, the chaebols had become so large and so deeply embedded in the Korean financial system that the original performance discipline had eroded. Companies that should have been allowed to fail were being kept alive by banks that could not afford to recognize the losses. The 1997 Asian financial crisis hit South Korea with devastating force precisely because the chaebol system had accumulated the same structural vulnerability it had been designed to avoid: concentrated risk, hidden losses, and institutions too politically connected to fail. The IMF bailout and the restructuring that followed were painful, public, and necessary. South Korea survived it and recovered. But the crisis was not an external shock that hit an otherwise healthy system. It was the mechanism's own internal logic, applied too long without the enforcement discipline that had made it work in the first place, producing exactly the kind of zombie economy that the original model had been designed to prevent. The mechanism that built South Korea and the mechanism that nearly broke it in 1997 were the same mechanism, operating under discipline in the first phase, operating without it in the second. That distinction is the entire lesson. Not that industrial policy works, not that it fails, that it works precisely as long as the enforcement condition is real and fails precisely when it stops being real. South Korea built one of the great economic success stories in modern history. It built it with a mechanism that was disciplined, sequential, and ruthlessly conditional. When the discipline eroded, the mechanism turned on itself. The math did not care about what had been built. It only cared about what the balance sheet said. And the balance sheets, as they always do, told the truth before anyone in the room was ready to hear it.